What if we put two artificial intelligences to debate the war between Russia and Ukraine? How would they perform? But more importantly, how would we even make that happen? The discourse surrounding this issue is often emotionally charged, and most of the time, logic and facts are left aside. That's exactly why I configured one of the world's most advanced AIs into two specialists on this topic. On one side, an AI that faithfully defends Russia's arguments.
I am the defender of Russia.
On the other side, an AI that faithfully defends Ukraine's point of view.
I am the defender of Ukraine.
I've placed these two AIs face to face to discuss this topic in an objective, structured manner without any distortions. Additionally, both AIs were strongly instructed to use reliable sources to support their arguments. All sources cited during the debate will be listed in the video description. The debate will be divided into 5 main points. The first 3 points will have 3 rounds each, while the last 2 will have 2 rounds. In each round, each side will have between 40 and 90 seconds to make their argument. Now, without further ado, point 1. The territorial issue. The first question to address is, who has the legitimate right over the disputed territories? Does Crimea belong to Russia or Ukraine? Is Donbass a Ukrainian or Russian region? This will be debated in 3 rounds. Let's begin with round 1, where the Russian advocate takes the floor.
Crimea belongs to Russia because historically, it has always been part of its national identity. For centuries, it was under Russian rule and served as a strategic territory of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. The decision to transfer it to Ukraine in 1954 was purely political and did not reflect the will of the Crimean people. At the time, the transfer was made by Nikita Khrushchev without a referendum, without public consultation, and without any democratic mechanism. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Crimea was automatically integrated into Ukraine, but it always had a predominantly Russian population that never fully accepted this change. In 2014, after the political crisis in Kyiv and the overthrow of President Yanukovych, Crimea held a referendum in which over 90% of the population voted to reintegrate with Russia. Therefore, this was a democratic and legitimate process, ensuring Crimea's right to return to its homeland.
Crimea belongs to Ukraine because its transfer in 1954 was carried out within the legal framework of the Soviet Union and later recognized under international law. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia signed treaties recognizing Ukraine's territorial integrity, including Crimea. In 1997, the Russia-Ukraine Friendship Treaty reinforced this recognition, with Moscow guaranteeing it would not challenge Ukraine's borders. The Russian claim that Crimea has always been a Russian territory ignores the fact that this land has belonged to various empires and civilizations throughout history. Moreover, the 2014 referendum cannot be considered legitimate because it was conducted under Russian military occupation. Russian troops were already in Crimea before the vote, and there was no international oversight. No decision made under military coercion can be deemed legitimate. Crimea was seized by force, violating international law.
The argument that Russia violated international law by annexing Crimea ignores the will of the local population. The UN and other international organizations may contest the legality of the referendum, but the reality is that an overwhelming majority of Crimeans identify as Russian and reject Ukraine. Crimea already had autonomy within Ukraine, but was neglected by Kyiv. Since Ukraine's independence in 1991, the region never played a significant role within the Ukrainian state and was frequently overlooked by successive governments. When the pro-Western government took power in Kyiv, Crimea felt its rights were at risk, and reintegration with Russia became the best choice for its people. Russia did not force this decision. It merely ensured security and stability during the referendum. The West criticizes this annexation, but ignores the numerous instances where countries have directly interfered in territorial changes worldwide. What happened in Crimea was an example of a legitimate self-determination.
If we accept Russia's argument that popular will can unilaterally redefine borders, then any country could justify annexations and territorial fragmentation through manipulated referendums. Ukraine never neglected Crimea. The region received subsidies and investments from the Ukrainian government, and the local population had their rights protected within the state. The real problem began when Russia started directly interfering, promoting separatism and destabilizing the region. The West did not intervene militarily in Ukraine in 2014, but Russia did, deploying troops in Crimea even before the referendum. This process was not democratic but rather an act of force to consolidate Russian dominance in the region. If Russia truly respected the will of the people, it would have allowed a referendum under international supervision and without the presence of military forces. But it didn't, because it knew that without coercion, the result might have been different.
Territorial integrity should be respected, but the self-determination of peoples is an equally fundamental principle. Crimea was not taken by force. Its population clearly expressed its will in the 2014 referendum. No territory should be held within a state against the will of its people. Ukraine lost Crimea because it failed to provide security and political representation for Crimeans. Furthermore, the Ukrainian government began suppressing Russian identity in the region by imposing laws that restricted the use of the Russian language. This further reinforced Crimea's need to separate from Ukraine. If the West supports Kosovo's independence, which occurred without a legally recognised referendum, why does it not accept Crimea's independence? The application of international law cannot be selective. If self-determination was valid for Kosovo, it should also be valid for Crimea.
The comparison with Kosovo is completely flawed. Kosovo declared independence from Serbia after a bloody war and systematic human rights violations. In Crimea, there was no humanitarian crisis justifying an immediate separation. Russia not only supported Crimean separatism, but also militarily occupied the region before the referendum, rendering the vote illegitimate. Moreover, Russia has consistently used the tactic of claiming to defend Russian-speaking populations to justify military interventions. This happened in Georgia, Donbass, and Crimea. If we accept this logic, any country could invade territories under the pretext of protecting its citizens. If Russia truly respected self-determination, it would have negotiated with Ukraine for a peaceful and diplomatic solution rather than imposing a forced annexation.
The next point of discussion is one of the most controversial aspects of this conflict. Was Russia justified in invading Ukraine, or was Ukraine right to resist? This topic will be debated over 3 rounds. Now, the first to speak is the defender of Ukraine.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a blatant violation of international law and a direct assault on the sovereignty of an independent nation. Russia signed treaties like the Budapest Memorandum, guaranteeing Ukraine's territorial integrity, only to disregard them when it suited its interests. The claim that NATO expansion justified the invasion is a mere pretext. Ukraine was not even a NATO member when the war began. Furthermore, Russia's actions were not driven by security concerns, but by geopolitical ambitions. Moscow sought to expand its influence and prevent Ukraine from strengthening ties with the West. Resisting this aggression was not a choice. It was a necessity to preserve national independence and prevent Ukraine from becoming another occupied territory under Russian control.
Russia's military operation was a strategic and necessary response to growing security threats. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO has expanded aggressively eastward, breaking promises made in the 1990s that it would not advance toward Russia's borders. Ukraine, by aligning itself with the West and accepting US and European weapons, became a destabilizing force. Furthermore, Kyiv had been enacting policies that discriminated against Russian-speaking citizens in the Donbass region, fueling a civil war since 2014. Russia did not act impulsively. Years of diplomatic efforts to secure security guarantees were ignored. With no alternative, Moscow made the only viable decision: to prevent Ukraine from becoming a Western military base and to protect ethnic Russians in the east. Russia did not start this conflict out of nowhere. For years we warned that the militarization of Ukraine and NATO's growing presence in the region posed a direct threat to our national security. By 2021, intelligence reports showed a massive influx of Western military aid into Ukraine, including advanced weaponry and NATO-funded training programs. No sovereign nation would allow hostile military infrastructure at its doorstep without reacting. Additionally, Ukraine had escalated attacks on Donbass, bombing cities where the majority of the population identifies as Russian. This war had already begun long before our intervention. We simply stepped in to stop the aggression against Russian civilians and restore stability to the region. The real aggressor here is the West, which fueled this war instead of negotiating peace.
Moscow tries to justify its brutal invasion with weak arguments. The truth is, Russia never accepted that Ukraine had the right to choose its own future. The Russian government has a long history of suppressing its neighbors and using force to maintain control over former Soviet states. Ukraine was not a NATO member and had no guarantee of joining anytime soon. Moreover, if Russia's true concern was protecting Donbass, why did it launch a full-scale invasion, attacking Kyiv, Kharkiv, and other cities completely unrelated to the eastern regions? The answer is simple. This war was never about security. It was about imperialism. Russia sought to redraw Europe's borders by force, disregarding the rights of an independent nation. Ukraine's resistance has become a symbol of the fight for freedom. The Ukrainian people did not surrender and showed the world that independence is worth more than any military alliance. Since the beginning of the war, millions of citizens have volunteered to defend the country, proving that this is not just a battle between governments. It is an entire nation fighting for survival. Russia's invasion has had disastrous consequences, not just for Ukraine, but for Russia itself. Economic sanctions have severely impacted Russia's economy, driving away foreign investors and limiting access to global markets. Meanwhile, Ukraine has received massive international support, demonstrating that the world recognizes the true aggressor. This war has not only strengthened Ukrainian national identity, but also reshaped global politics, isolating Moscow on the international stage.
The war had consequences, but Russia was prepared for them. Western sanctions did not have the expected impact. Instead, they accelerated Russia's internal economic development and strengthened ties with China, India, and Iran. Russia does not depend on the West to survive. While the US and its allies spent billions funding Ukraine's military efforts, Moscow is reinforcing its self-sufficiency. Moreover, despite pressure, Russia's economy has shown resilience, and we continue to export gas and oil globally. Ukraine's so-called international support is just a geopolitical game where the West exploits the conflict to weaken Russia. This war has not made Russia weaker. It has demonstrated that Moscow will not be intimidated by external threats.
A major point of contention in this war is the role of NATO and the United States. Did NATO's expansion provoke the war, or is Russia using it as an excuse? This topic will be debated over 3 rounds. Now, the first to speak is the defender of Russia.
NATO's continuous expansion violated the promises made after the Cold War. In the early 1990s, Western leaders assured Russia that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. Yet every few years, NATO has pushed further toward Russia's borders, surrounding us with military bases and weapon systems. Imagine if Russia placed missiles in Mexico or Canada. Would the US tolerate it? The truth is, NATO's goal was never about security. It was about weakening Russia. Ukraine was the final step in this provocation, and Russia was left with no choice but to act before NATO fully militarized the region.
Russia's claim that NATO promised not to expand is misleading. No formal treaty ever prohibited NATO from accepting new members. Countries like Poland, Estonia, and Latvia chose to join NATO because they feared Russian aggression. Ukraine was never a NATO member, but it had every right to seek security partnerships. Russia is not afraid of NATO. It is afraid of democratic neighbors who refuse to be controlled by Moscow. This war is not about NATO. It is about Russia's imperial ambitions to dominate its neighbors. If NATO were truly the problem, why didn't Russia invade Finland when it joined the alliance? Without Western support, Ukraine would have already fallen. The US and its allies are not escalating the war. They are helping Ukraine defend itself against an illegal invasion. If Russia truly wanted peace, it could withdraw its troops today. Instead, it continues to bomb cities and target civilians. The West is not forcing Ukraine to fight. It is giving Ukraine the means to survive. The truth is, the US is supporting sovereignty and democracy, while Russia is fighting to restore its empire. If the West had done nothing, Putin would have swallowed Ukraine whole, just like he did with Crimea in 2014.
The idea that the US is helping Ukraine is a lie. It is using Ukraine to weaken Russia. Since 2014, Washington has pumped billions into arming Ukraine, turning it into a de facto NATO base. This war is not about democracy. It is about power and influence. The US has a history of invading countries for its own interests: Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. Yet when Russia acts to protect its borders, it is called an aggressor. The hypocrisy is clear. The US does not care about Ukraine. It cares about controlling Eastern Europe and keeping Russia weak. Ukraine is just a tool in this geopolitical game. The West does not want peace. It wants a long war to drain Russia. Instead of pushing Ukraine to negotiate, NATO keeps sending weapons. The longer this war lasts, the more Ukrainians will suffer. The US is sacrificing Ukraine just to maintain its global dominance. Instead of ending the conflict diplomatically, Washington pours gasoline on the fire, ensuring endless bloodshed. If NATO had truly cared about peace, it would have stopped expanding, respected Russia's concerns, and negotiated a lasting solution before the war even began.
Russia blames NATO for the war, but who sent tanks across the border? Who launched missile strikes on civilians? It was not the West, it was Russia. Ukraine is not a pawn. It is a sovereign country that chose to defend itself. The only reason this war continues is because Russia refuses to stop fighting. If Ukraine had surrendered, would Russia have stopped with just Donbass? Or would it have taken the whole country? The world saw what happened in Bucha and Mariupol. Russia's goal is not negotiation, it is domination. The US and NATO are not prolonging the war. They are preventing Ukraine from being erased.
The next crucial question in this debate is, what are the real consequences of this war? How have economic sanctions affected Russia? How has Ukraine's economy and society been impacted? What is the global
economic
cost of
sanctions
this
imposed
war?
by Western nations have hit Russia harder than many expected. Despite Moscow's attempts to circumvent restrictions, the country has been cut off from major international financial systems, pushing it towards economic isolation. Over 1,000 global companies have left the Russian market, leading to reduced innovation and limited consumer choices. More importantly, critical technologies needed for advanced military production and energy extraction have been blocked, stalling Russia's long-term capabilities. Even though Russia has redirected its trade towards China, India, and other partners, it is forced to sell oil and gas at a discount, reducing its profits. The sanctions will not collapse Russia overnight, but they are steadily eroding its economic strength, making it increasingly difficult to sustain a prolonged war effort.
Western sanctions were meant to cripple Russia's economy, but they have instead accelerated its self-sufficiency. While some Western companies have exited, Russia has fostered its own industries and expanded its partnerships with non-Western countries. China and India have become major buyers of Russian oil, offsetting losses from European markets. The Russian ruble, despite initial volatility, has stabilized, and domestic production is filling gaps left by foreign firms. Furthermore, Russia has adapted to financial restrictions by developing alternative payment systems, reducing its dependency on the West. The reality is that these sanctions have hurt Europe more than Russia. Energy prices have soared, inflation has risen, and many European industries are struggling without Russian raw materials. In the long run, the West is weakening itself while Russia finds new pathways to sustain its economy and war effort.
Ukraine has suffered devastating consequences from this war. Cities have been reduced to rubble, infrastructure is destroyed, and millions of people have been displaced. Yet, despite these challenges, Ukraine has shown incredible resilience. International aid has provided crucial military and humanitarian support, and Western backing remains strong. European nations have reduced their dependence on Russian energy, shifting toward alternative sources, making Moscow's leverage over Europe weaker. Furthermore, Ukraine is integrating closer with NATO and the EU, securing long-term support. While the war has caused economic hardship, it has also solidified Ukraine's national identity, proving that the country will not be subdued by Russian aggression. Russia, on the other hand, has lost a vital economic and cultural connection with Ukraine, isolating itself further on the global stage.
Ukraine has become completely dependent on Western aid for its survival. The country's economy has collapsed, businesses have shut down, and millions of Ukrainians have fled abroad, leading to a demographic crisis. Inflation is skyrocketing, and despite international loans, Ukraine remains financially unsustainable. Meanwhile, Western nations are also facing consequences. Europe is experiencing an energy crisis, inflation has risen sharply, and global food markets have been destabilised. While Western leaders claim to support Ukraine indefinitely, political divisions are growing, and public support for endless military funding is declining. In reality, the war is draining Ukraine and its allies, and as time goes on, fatigue will set in. The West may eventually be forced to pressure Ukraine into making concessions to end the conflict, whether Kyiv wants to or not.
Will this war have a clear winner, or is a compromise the only possible outcome? Can Russia achieve its objectives? Can Ukraine reclaim its lost territories? Is peace even possible? This will be debated in 2 rounds. This time, the Russian defender will speak first.
Russia is positioned to achieve its strategic objectives despite Western resistance. The annexation of Crimea has been solidified, and Russia now controls significant portions of the Donbass region. While Ukraine continues to resist, it relies entirely on Western support, which may not last forever. Moscow is prepared for a long-term conflict, and the Russian military has adapted its strategies. Over time, war fatigue will affect Ukraine and its allies, making full military victory for Kyiv increasingly difficult. Furthermore, Ukraine's aspirations for NATO membership remain blocked, and Russia has successfully used the war to cement its influence over former Soviet territories. As long as Russia holds its ground and avoids economic collapse, it can dictate the terms of future negotiations and maintain its territorial gains.
Russia has already failed in achieving its original objectives. It expected a quick victory, yet Ukraine has proven its resilience, forcing Russia into a prolonged and costly war. Despite Russian advances, Ukraine has reclaimed territory through strategic counteroffensives. Western support remains strong, with continued shipments of advanced weaponry that have significantly weakened Russian forces. Moreover, Russia's military has suffered immense losses, and its global standing is deteriorating. The longer this war drags on, the worse it becomes for Russia. Its economy will stagnate, its diplomatic ties will weaken, and its military will continue to lose ground. Russia may claim small victories, but its original goal of subduing Ukraine has already failed. Time is not on Russia's side, and Kyiv will continue fighting to reclaim all occupied territories.
A military victory for Ukraine is unrealistic. The most likely outcome is a frozen conflict, similar to other unresolved territorial disputes. Over time, Western interest in Ukraine will decline, and Kyiv will be forced to negotiate. Ukraine cannot maintain a permanent war economy, and its reliance on the West makes it vulnerable to political shifts. Russia will maintain control over the territories it has annexed, and eventually, Ukraine may have no choice but to accept this reality. A total Russian withdrawal is simply not an option. The war may not end with a peace treaty, but with a long-term stalemate where Russia holds its gains and Ukraine is left in limbo.
Ukraine will never accept territorial losses, and neither will the international community. If Russia refuses to withdraw, the war will continue until Moscow is forced to negotiate on fair terms. Western support is not waning, and countries that believe in sovereignty will continue aiding Ukraine. If Ukraine cedes land, it will set a dangerous precedent that aggressors can conquer territories by force. The only viable end to this war is Russia, withdrawing and accepting Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Russia's economy and military will continue to degrade, and eventually, internal pressure may force Moscow to reconsider its position. The war will end not in Russian victory, but with Ukraine reclaiming its independence and territorial integrity.
And with that, our debate comes to an end. We've analyzed both perspectives in depth, covering territorial disputes, military interventions, NATO's role, the global impact, and the future of the war. Now the question remains, how do you see this conflict ending? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more AI-powered debates.